Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Business Ethics. Congratulations. You've made it to the final lecture of the semester. Before we get started, I did want to make a quick note about a couple of things. So first, the worksheet is a little different than the ones that you've done in the past. In particular, there's no long answer question. Yay. However, there are a few more short answer questions, and the short answer question lengths should range from 2 to 5 sentences. So in the past, the suggested length was 2 to 4 sentences. And now there's going to be some questions that maybe require a little bit more than that. So just bear that in mind while you're working on the worksheet. And if you're concerned that you haven't answered a question all the way or something like this, you're always welcome to email me. Obviously, if you're emailing me the day that it's due, I can't promise that I'll get back, but I will get back eventually. So at least you'll have that information for the final. So if you're concerned about any of your answers, please email me. I will eventually get back to you, and you'll be able to figure it out. Okay. The other note is one on terminology. So there's a couple of words I want to talk about that are going to be relevant. Well, one of them's relevant. The other one you'll see in a second. But so I want to just give a sort of for those of you who are not familiar with the term Indigenous, how it's getting used now. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the term Native American. There, for a number of reasons we don't need to get into, that's a term that, it's, we're talking about a lot of different kinds of people, in particular, Indigenous people in the United States and to some extent in Canada, or that's who Kyle White from the podcast, those are the people that he had in mind, or that he has in mind when he's talking about his stuff related to climate justice. And so sometimes it gets hard because there's a lot of reasons why people want to keep certain distinctions, right? So say Blackfeet, somebody who's Blackfeet, they would want to, it's important that part of that identity that they have, that is much different than being Diné, but also gets also known as Navajo. So there was a lot of historical conflict between those two groups. And so sometimes getting lumped into the same category can feel a little bit annoying. Now, with that said, there's a lot of shared, there's a lot of problems that these different groups share, right? Because for the most part, the United States hasn't upheld its end of the bargain in any of these treaties that it signed with these different groups. And so when we're talking about things like climate change, and like the way that Indigenous groups in the United States and in Canada are being affected by climate change, a lot of those share a lot of similar problems, a lot of similar concerns. So when Kyle White is referring to these different groups of people all as Indigenous, it makes sense for him to do so. I just want everyone to bear in mind that there are other times where maintaining that distinction is really important to a person. So if you hear a particular quote from someone, and like an Indigenous person, and you want to sort of reference something it is that they said, it's worthwhile, for their sake and for yours, to go and see, like where they're actually from, like who their people actually are, right? A similar way that you can kind of, or sort of like an analogous thing that you can think about is like, sometimes it makes sense, all of the different countries that are belong to the area that gets referred to on the map as like the Caribbean islands, right? Sometimes it makes sense to just refer to that entire place as the Caribbean or the Caribbean islands, like with climate change, right? There's a lot of shared concerns, shared worries, shared problems that all these different countries have. But there are other times where it's important to say that someone is Dominican, right? Like it's important to say that like a part of a person's culture is like they're Dominican, their family's Dominican, something like this, right? That's because that's different, even though they share a border, say, with Haiti. That's different than yeah, even though even though the DR shares a border with Haiti, and there's some times where it makes sense to be like, oh yeah, that's all part of the Caribbean, right? There are other times where it's really important to keep that distinct. So I just want everybody to sort of like bear that in mind, or if you could think of your own example, some instance where somebody was like, oh yeah, like saying like lumping together everybody, like a bunch of people like from, say, all from New York City, right? That's one that happens a lot. If you're born and raised in the Bronx, or if you have like deep family ties there, like sometimes it's really important to recognize that like what you're talking about, say maybe a particular issue, some kind of issue you're talking about that's going on in the Bronx, like that's not just New York in general, especially not New York State. Like that's a specific place. It's important to look at it. It would be sort of like if Mayor Adams was like, we're going to fix all of the subway systems. We're going to make sure that we have trains running efficiently from Manhattan to Brooklyn. We're going to put all this money in. We're going to, finally fix all of the problems that happened after Sandy. And we're going to fix the subway system. And then he puts in all this money and it's all trains that run between Brooklyn and the city. That's not going to be doing anything to help. For those of you, I mean, maybe incidentally it'll help in some sorts of ways, but like that's not doing very much in the way of like helping trains that are running to the Bronx. Like that's probably the lines that like you take to get to school, for example, like that's probably not going to do you a whole lot of good. So for somebody to say, oh, we fixed the subway system, the MTA is great now because we got all these trains running super well. We have brand new trains running in, all of these repaired and updated lines, like running from Manhattan to Brooklyn. That's not a good generalization to make because you're still dealing with your issues. That doesn't have anything to do with you. So just bearing that in mind, if you ever find yourself wanting to like quote an indigenous person or something like this, or if you're trying to like reference a particular issue, just double checking, making sure that the generalization makes sense. That's the first note. The second is about a term I do not want to see in any of the worksheets. I do not want to see the term developing countries used anywhere. I know it's something that's mentioned in the book, and it's something that it was a term that people started sort of using instead of this word, third world countries, which is a total, I won't get into that. If anyone's curious, you're welcome to email me, but third world countries is something that is referencing the way that a few different countries were grouped during the Cold War. And it doesn't actually like oftentimes literally include the sorts of things that people have in mind when they're talking about it, because most often when words like that get thrown around, there are these sweeping generalizations made, and then you sort of like lose sight of the specific problems in different places where you're kind of like roughly imagining when you're like, yeah, these developing countries that like don't have this sort of thing or don't have that sort of thing, or like they're all really poor and people don't have, it's not as simple as that. There's very specific issues that some of the places that you may have in mind are facing. So for example, if you're in the podcast with Olufemi Taiwo, he talks a lot about the African continent. And he talks in particular, he's talking a lot about just the southern area of the African continent, right? So, so you're thinking, so those are going to be places like Uganda, Ethiopia, the Congo, things like this. And if you really think about it, sort of referring to any of those places as developing doesn't really make sense, because it's not like, oh, they were like these places that were like insulated in these little time capsules, and like everybody else built a bunch of stuff and like irrigated and all of this stuff, and like have all these, you know, like we have, there's, you know, there's like Nairobi in Kenya is a huge city, right? And it's really important to recognize that development isn't as much of the issue. Like that, yes, there are certain like issues with infrastructure, but the real issue, and this is something that you have listened to the podcast interview with Olufemi Taiwo, or you're gonna learn about this, where the real issue here is colonization, where you had these foreign countries coming in, oftentimes to some extent arbitrarily drawing borders, so lumping groups of people together that never thought of themselves as belonging to like the same country, often, or not oftentimes, but in some cases, even like lumping together groups, political bodies, organized political bodies of people, lumping together in the same place, when there had been, you know, like a long history of a lot of conflict. So really what we're talking about or oftentimes what the places that people have in mind when they use this term developing countries is actually places that are recovering from colonialism. They're recovering from, you know, some foreign person coming in, drawing a border, saying, you know, all that, the commerce that you used to do, so essentially like the jobs that you're accustomed to getting, the way that you get food, the kind of food you eat, who's in charge of you, all of these different things. I mean, things that really shape the way our world looks. All of those things are thrown out the window, and we're just like, you know, putting you in an entirely different set of circumstances, and that can really tear up you know, previously well developed systems, organizations, governing bodies, infrastructures, and the like. So again, I want to reiterate, I do not want to see any use of the term developing countries on the worksheets. And if you find that you're tempted to use that term, just sit, maybe close your eyes, think about the exact place that you have in mind. Like I know everyone has access to Google, look at a map. If there's a particular few countries that you're like, oh yeah, these are the places that I'm thinking about, these are where I think, you know, like various like coastal areas or something like this, then reference those places, because it matters in the same way that it matters that, you know, the Bronx doesn't always get lumped in with all of New York. Like there's like specific things, there's specific issues that you might have with like the MTA, that it's important to recognize you're talking about the Bronx. You're not just talking about, you're not talking about some kind of MTA issue like in Brooklyn. Okay. Now we can move on to the lecture. Okay, so we're going to be talking about climate justice and sustainability. And this is going to be a pretty short lecture. For the most part, what I want to do is give everybody a sort of general idea of what it is we're talking about, because we understand what climate change is, and now everyone has done a wonderful job showing me that you definitely understand what business ethics is. So, you know, like, how are those two things interconnected? Well, or rather, one way that we can sort of generalize the question that we're going to have in mind while we're evaluating all these different pieces here is this question of, when businesses benefit from economic activities that harm other people, what do they owe those people they harmed? Okay, so one thing that we're going to see is sort of like common thread in these different approaches in answering this question is we're going to be thinking about, you know, like specifically what happened, specifically who did it, and specifically who got hurt. Okay, so the textbook takes one approach. And the way that they sort of couch it is in this idea, this concept of earth jurisprudence, where like we have talked about before, corporations, like, they enjoy the status of personhood, right? They get these certain rights and privileges, even though a corporation isn't a person, they get certain rights and privileges that that people get. And so the argument for earth jurisprudence is that we should think of the earth in the same way. The earth is a person, and therefore the earth should enjoy some rights and privileges, which are going to include, if there is some sort of, if earthly resources are taken, if somebody's using that to profit, then they owe something back to the earth. Like, you can't just, you can't just take something. For those of you who have like little, like, young people in your life, like little children around at all, like parents, siblings, whatever, your parents, or you have siblings or whatever. Like, when you see a little kid just grab something from, either an adult or another little kid, right? We think like, no, you can't, there's reason why you don't do that. And so the idea of earth jurisprudence is sort of saying a similar thing to corporations, being like, you can't just keep grabbing that. Like, that's a person, you need to like respect them. You need to treat them accordingly. So when it comes to this question of, okay, when a corporation hurts the earth, so this is maybe something we can quantify in terms of like CO2 emissions, carbon footprints, whatever. When we see like ecosystems that are suffering, things like this, then we can start to really think about like, okay, so this particular kind of like production, manufacturing, the use of this particular resource, this ended up resulting in some kind of like harm to the earth or a particular species or ecosystem, like I said. And consequently, the corporation owes something back. And so that's all fine and good. We could think about it in those terms of sort of like a compensation, like having to give back. But in the face of everything that we know now, just about how much climate change is escalating and the kind of severe change that we're going to be facing very soon, and in some places, or rather a lot of places, currently are, we also need to think about mitigating and preventing harm from happening, because it's about to turn a corner and it's about to get really bad. Okay, so we do have this question of, what do you owe when you hurt others? But there's also this question of, what do you owe to not, like, what sorts of obligations do you have to not hurt others, right? So when we're thinking about the question in that way, in terms of the obligations connected with harm, we're going to start thinking about ways to prevent actions that need to be taken in order to prevent climate change. And there are two types of solutions that the book talks about, or that the textbook talks about. One of them is by appeal to different governments, right? So putting regulations in place that prohibit certain kinds of economic activities, maybe like caps at a certain point, like they're only allowed to pollute this much, sort of thing. Or potentially, making certain things illegal to do. For example, banning plastic bags, things like this. The other solution the book talks about, and to be clear, this is never like we can only do one thing, right? All of the things that we talked about, so compensating for past harms done, preventing harms in the future, one of those things may include regulation. Another thing that you can do simultaneously would be sort of this game of trying to convince different kinds of corporate entities or industries that updating updating to sustainable production practices, say, is ultimately going to be more profitable for them, right? And so if we think back to all the fiduciary duty stuff, all the stuff that you ought to be doing for those shareholders, right? Getting them the biggest bang for their buck is the best possible thing you can do. So if you can convince, say, CEOs, managers, things like this, wow, if we upgrade to these like more sustainable business practices, we're actually going to be making money. It's not, now we don't have to think about jurisprudence anymore, or sorry, we don't have to think about earth jurisprudence anymore. We can just be sort of like sneaking this into to fiduciary duties to shareholders. Okay, so and there's a number of other sorts of things in this framework that you could suggest different, there's a lot more policies, as well as like ways to convince businesses that, more sustainable, updating to more sustainable practices would be profitable. But this is just the sort of the general gist of like the approach of this problem, approaching this question about the things that businesses do or may do that would cause harm in terms of climate change, and the obligations that they have not to cause that harm or to repair the harm that they've done. That's one approach. The other approach is the one that, in general, both Olufemi Taiwo and Kyle Whyte take in their discussions about climate change. So for those of you who have yet to listen to the podcast, I strongly suggest you pause this video right now. If you need to, mark down where you are in the time and go and listen to those podcasts, because I'm not going to be going into depth into explaining their views. It would be good for you to be a little bit familiar with the sorts of things that they're talking about, and then come and watch the lecture video. So if you haven't listened to those yet, hit the pause button, go listen to that, come back to this lecture. Okay. So this different approach, in general, and although neither philosopher explicitly mentions this in the interviews that you listen to, in general, both Taiwo and Whyte are saying, hold on, this stuff about climate change, this question about businesses, obligations that they have, sort of maybe loose references to like different stakeholders and things like this. Like, we need to worry about like the stakeholders, the people who get affected. That's not really getting at the problem. The fact that corporations were put in a position where they were capable of affecting the environment to this extent is part of a larger problem of how we distribute social power. So in order to understand, really to answer that question, that central question on the first slide, in order to understand what kinds of obligations corporations have when it comes to, the role that they play in climate change and the harm that they cause as a result, we have to understand what preceded their being in that, corporations being in that position in the first place. So like I mentioned, the thing that preceded it, or rather, like we have these systems, right? You have to be in a rather powerful position in order to have that big of an industry affect that kind of change. And what both Whyte and Taiwo talk about are these patterns that we've seen going for a really long time. Many different groups of people who are systematically denied enough social power to really influence what their surroundings look like, right? So I was kind of talking about that a little bit ago when I was talking about, why we want to say a place that's recovering from colonialism, or places recovering from colonialism versus like a developing country. And sort of the reason why they got in that position in the first place is there was this foreign power that came in, arbitrarily drew some borders, and really messed with their stuff. Like messed maybe with like their economic systems, their governing systems, access to certain resources, things like this, including affecting their climate, right? So this is something that Kyle White talks about also, where this idea that we are just now for the first time seeing we're for the first time seeing a dominant group, a powerful group, polluting the environment to the extent that it affects the livelihood and the well-being of a less powerful group that the dominant group to some extent controls. Thinking that this is the first time that's happening is, you know, he says like that's a total misunderstanding of what's actually been going on. For example, England, but most certainly like France and other countries, but European countries really got colonization going in what's now the United States. One of the first things that they did was they hacked down all the trees, and the trees have a big impact on the different ecosystems they exist within, right? It made areas hotter. It affected the kind of plants and animals that you found in those areas, you know, so they were messing with food sources, things like this. So this really is not the first time that this sort of thing has happened. And this, and, you know, when we think about Indigenous groups in the and tribes in the United States, or we think about, you know, areas of like the Southern African continent, of the southern part of the African continent, what we find these patterns of people who are really, have had a really hard time exercising a lot of control over what their lives look like. And in a lot of ways, like labor and the resources, like natural resources that they have access to, like those things have been subject to exploitation by these foreign powers, made life a lot more difficult, right? And so when we think about those patterns, what we're seeing there is there's like these different kinds of systems where social power has been distributed in a way where it's left a small group of people with a lot of power. And in order to really maintain that power, they have to withhold that kind of power from larger groups. And as a result, the larger groups with less power end up getting hurt in a lot of different ways. So when we see that, what we should notice is even though we don't have the, say the foreign powers of like the European sort where they were like coming in and like planting flags in the ground now, what we do have, and Taiwo talks a lot about this, is this problem of neocolonialism, where we have a lot of corporations that are coming in and effectively doing the same thing. Now that's something that you'll get a little bit more in depth with when you listen. For those of you who listen to the podcast, you can recall he talks about land grabs after the financial crisis of 2008. It's a really good example of the sort of thing I'm talking about. If you don't remember that part of the podcast, I suggest you go back and give it a listen. I think it's about midway through, because there is going to be, or as you may have seen already, there's definitely a question on that point in particular. But the point in general here, so on the second point of the PowerPoint slide, is that we want to see if there's like a pattern of this sort of thing happening. Or rather, we need to find the pattern of this sort of thing happening, because people don't just fall into these positions of power where they're able to like affect the world on a global scale. It just so happened that way, right? Like there's some kind of system we have in place to give people that sort of power. And that's not to necessarily say that that is something that is it like in and of itself bad or wrong. Rather, what both White and Teo are looking at is that there are specific situations now where those systems did give rise to things that are harmful and bad. But just I think it's really important for everybody to remember that it's not saying that, you know, the whole, people most certainly believe the whole system is, this is evidence, whole system's broken, we need to throw it out, start from scratch, start over sort of thing. But it's really important for those of you who that kind of thinking doesn't really resonate, understand that this isn't what they're necessarily saying. They're not saying to go to that extreme, you know, tear it down, burn it up. It's just to say we need to look at, we have some past bad habits. We have some bad systems, perhaps, or we have like a particular group that's doing a lot of harm. And we need to sort of address that. There's still most certainly ways in which we could still operate within these same systems while simultaneously giving these groups of people that have like a long history of being, you know, severely hurt. There's ways to sort of give them more power and put them in a position where, you know, just because of your cultural identity, like just because you're Indigenous, like that doesn't mean that you need to constantly have to worry about your livelihood and well-being. Like there's ways that we can support that better. So it's not, I just want everybody to remember, we're not talking about something necessarily super extreme here when we're talking about we have these systems for distributing social power. And so we need to like tear those systems down. There's most definitely arguments to be made to fix those things as well. And when we look at the ways in which those past systems have put us in bad situations now, when we find these patterns of, you know, like big groups of people, like just consistently experiencing a lot of harm, we want to think about how the systems of the past shaped the systems that we have now. So a really great point that Kyle White makes in the interview with Maisha Cherry is he says, you know, the idea that the people who did all this bad stuff to Indigenous people, like the first colonizers say, like they're dead. So we're sort of in this bad luck situation now where it's like, it's unfortunate that like there's issues with the land that, you know, various Indigenous groups have been allotted, but there's nobody really alive now who's responsible for it. So, you know, like, what do we do? Like, should we have like you know, all of these like all Americans should be like paying to like help Indigenous people out, you know, like they didn't do anything wrong, sort of thing. And what Kyle White points out is he says that's a really ridiculous way to look at it, because the chain of events, the causal chain of events, right? So the thing that caused this thing that caused this thing that brought us to where we are now. So brought like Indigenous groups to where they are now, just with respect to climate change and the struggles they're facing with it. That causal chain of events is unbroken. And we can actually identify like a lot of specific groups, even corporations, and as well as like specific US policies. So we're not even saying the general government here, but specific policies that have been contributing to this problem, sort of like supporting this really bad position that a lot of different Indigenous groups have found themselves in. And so when we do that kind of introspection and we're like, okay, maybe it's not totally obvious to us right now, but maybe we have some systems like a specific policy in place for dealing with something. And oh, wow, like that policy has been in place and been perpetuating some of this really bad stuff for a long time. Once we see that, then what we see is we find that there are things, maybe not specific people, but definitely something like policy, I think a similar argument could probably be made against like different universities that relied on like slave labor, right? So like, I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but Yale and Harvard have a very, they have a lot of the university, like the actual like construction and like support of the universities, like they had a lot of slaves working for those universities. So when we start to look at the ways that these individual institutions, maybe corporations or policies, have sort of been benefited by supporting these problems that, you know, entire groups of people face, we do find entities that are responsible for this harm. And so we have reason to mitigate that harm. You know, if a person had there was a lot of old wealth in a family, say from the South, and a lot of that wealth originated with slave labor, and then after slavery was abolished, relied on sharecropping, and then like continues to like exploit labor to this day, right? What we end up seeing, because that is the case for places in the South, what we find there is we see like, oh, this is actually, you know, this particular corporation or organization has just like been consistently relying on like exploitative labor for a very long time. Like maybe they in those sorts of cases they owe something back because they keep sort of taking advantage of a situation or perpetuating a problematic labor practice. So that's the kind of introspection and thinking that both White and To'o are advocating for, is like just doing some history, just looking back, seeing if we can find one of those causal chains for things, because when we identify that, we can go, oh, hey, that's how we recognize these common threads that are putting us into the situation we are in now. So like it says on the last point here, once we have these kinds of questions, once we're doing these close examinations, we're like thinking about what the history of this particular social problem is, the group that has been affected for it, the group that has been affected by it and harmed by it. Then what we can do is we can start to think about the role that corporations now have in terms of their moral obligations to mitigate the effects of climate change, or perhaps really change their practices altogether. Now, I think that so that about sums it up for the slide, this part of the lecture. And I did want to acknowledge for this particular module period, this is probably the most philosophy thinking that we're going to do. So one thing that happens a lot in philosophy is we do this thing where we kind of like get these abstract concepts, or we try to come up with these abstract frameworks for like framing things in certain ways, seeing things in certain ways. It's sort of like, you know, sometimes from one angle, something looks another way. And then if you change it to another angle, right? We've all had this experience, probably like taking pictures of our faces, or at least like you've known people like, oh no, I don't like it when it's like whatever. That's sort of what we're doing on a conceptual level in philosophy. So this sort of like the two approaches that I just laid out to you, that's what was going on there. Where we have kind of it's just a straight on front view, like, okay, so we got some harm going on, we got some people responsible for that harm, we got some threat of future harm. All right, what are the moral obligations of businesses there to stop doing some of that harm or make up for some of the harm that they caused? And then we have it from a different angle, Maybe one way that you can think about is like an angle from the bottom where you're just like looking to see where all of that stuff is growing from. And it's at that point sort of like looking at the way the world needs to be, how the world needs to be structured, that sort of thing. What it needs to look like in order for this kind of harm to be happening, in order for people to get displaced. And like, and you think about and you recognize like those people are people that have been like suffering because they don't have access to the kind of social power that other groups have access to for a really long time. So what is going on there? And that's ultimately why the other big important piece that Te'o and White have in common is they advocate for autonomy, groups being able to make choices about what their world looks like. So that thing that I was talking about with colonization in the beginning of the video, where there's just this part of it where it's like, yeah, you have somebody, if you could sort of imagine if someone like just set down all of these metal fences, blocked off access to like all the stores that you normally go to, filled the streets with like a bunch of different people. Some of the people spoke like you could like speak the same language as them, and then the other people like you have just no idea what was going on. Like the world looks a lot different. It messes stuff up. That would be a bummer, right? Like, no, sorry, you can't do that kind of job anymore. No, like you don't get to eat that food anymore. Or you don't have access to like milk anymore or meat anymore or something like this, right? Like that would make your life like pretty hard. It would be a bummer. And what Te'o and White are saying is the solution when it comes to this bummer of climate change is giving these groups who historically oppressed groups of the past more power to self-determine and decide what their world looks like. So that's a little bit obviously more complicated than the approach that the textbook takes. And again, just to reiterate, you can do both things. Both things can none of the things that we're talking about here is the case where it's like, oh, you can like, we're not having to like pick one option. There's things, all of these things can come in combination. But for White and Te'o, what they want to say is that you have to start looking up at the bottom. You have to think where this stuff is coming from, because it's a part of a much larger system of social power distribution. All right, so that about does it for this lecture. I will be posting another video just to sort of touch base, some things about the final exam, things like this. In the meantime, if anyone has any questions about any upcoming assignments, past assignments, things like this, you are welcome to email me. All right, thanks everyone.